In the summer of 1942, the skies above Asia turned into a silent battleground. Imagine standing on the ground in northern India, watching as a transport aircraft climbed slowly into the clouds, its engines straining against the weight of supplies packed inside. The horizon was dominated by the jagged peaks of the Himalayas, mountains so vast and unforgiving that they seemed to pierce the heavens themselves. Pilots looked toward those snow-capped giants with a mixture of awe and dread, knowing that their survival depended on threading their way through storms that swallowed entire planes without a trace. This was not a mission of conquest, but of survival, for what lay beyond those mountains was China, desperate and cut off from the world. China in 1942 was on the brink of collapse. The Japanese invasion had left the country bleeding, its cities shattered, and its armies exhausted. With the fall of Burma, the last overland supply route had been severed. What remained was a nation fighting alone, clinging to hope against overwhelming odds. The United States, newly committed to the global war, recognized that keeping China in the fight was essential to slowing Japan's advance. Yet the only possible solution meant facing one of the most dangerous flight paths ever attempted. They called it the Hump. The term sounded simple, almost casual, but it belied the terror behind it. The Hump referred to a section of the Himalayas that pilots would have to cross to deliver supplies to China. At altitudes where the air was so thin that engines often failed and men gasped for breath, every flight became a gamble with fate. The Himalayas were not merely mountains, they were walls of stone and ice, shrouded in cloud, hiding winds that could rip a plane apart in seconds. Even for the most skilled pilot, the journey was an ordeal, unlike anything they had ever faced before. For the young and inexperienced, it was a nightmare waiting to unfold. Each departure carried with it a heavy silence. Crews gathered on the tarmac in India, adjusting their flight gear, checking cargo holds filled with fuel, ammunition, and crates of medicine. The sun beat down on the airstrips, but every man knew that within hours they would be flying through freezing storms that could cover the cockpit glass with ice. Radios were unreliable, weather reports scarce, and navigation tools primitive. Many did not speak of the danger aloud, but in their eyes lay the knowledge that not every plane would return. In the stillness before takeoff, it was as if each man quietly prepared himself for a final journey. The Chinese people, on the other side of those mountains, waited with desperation. In their cities and villages, supplies dwindled and morale faltered. The Japanese advance threatened to smother what resistance remained. For them, the rumble of American aircraft in the distance was more than the sound of engines. It was the sound of survival, the promise that they had not been abandoned to face the storm alone. Every crate that arrived carried not just tools of war, but also the message that their struggle mattered, that they were part of a larger fight. To the pilots, the mission carried an emotional weight beyond strategy. They were not just ferrying cargo. They were carrying hope across the sky. Imagine being inside one of those planes, the engines roaring, the cockpit trembling as wind struck from every side. Through the windshield you see nothing but clouds and white peaks rising higher and higher. You know that if the storm turns worse, or if the engines fail, there is no safe landing, only the jagged rocks below. In those moments, the line between life and death was as thin as the air they breathed. The Hump became the most dangerous supply route in the world, yet also one of the most essential. America had committed itself to a task that defied logic, sending wave after wave of transport aircraft into the deadliest skies on Earth. Each journey was a statement of defiance against the odds, a refusal to surrender to geography or the enemy. By lifting their eyes to the mountains and daring to cross them, these pilots forged a bridge of survival for an ally on the edge of defeat. In this battle of endurance and faith, the story of the Hump began. Before 1942, China's lifeline to the outside world ran through Burma. Long caravans of trucks and men carried food, weapons, and fuel along a rough but steady overland route. It was far from easy, but it was reliable enough to keep Chinese forces supplied and fighting. When Japanese troops surged forward and captured Burma, that artery was cut in a matter of weeks. The contrast was devastating. What had once been a flow of resources across land now dried up almost overnight, leaving China stranded in the heart of the war. The difference between the old supply convoys and the new reality could not have been more striking. On the ground, convoys had relied on sheer persistence, with drivers navigating muddy tracks and dense jungles. There were breakdowns, ambushes, and exhaustion. But there was always the possibility of fixing a vehicle or pushing forward. In the air, there was no such margin for error. A frozen engine at high altitude meant a plunge into mountain slopes that offered no chance of survival. Every mile of airspace replaced the security of a road with the unforgiving indifference of the sky. Pilots who had once trained for ordinary transport missions found themselves in a new world of danger. Imagine sitting in the cockpit, climbing higher and higher as the mountains drew closer. At 10,000 feet, the air grew thin and breathing became a struggle. At 15,000 feet, storms rolled across the horizon, lightning flashing against the snowy peaks. Radios crackled with static, sometimes falling silent altogether. There were no highways to follow, no villages below to mark the way, only shifting clouds and the ever-present risk of being swallowed by them. The contrast between the steady grind of a land convoy and the invisible perils of the Hump was as sharp as the edge of a blade. The Chinese who depended on these supplies could see the difference just as clearly. Where once entire convoys brought hundreds of tons of material across the border, now only small amounts trickled in. A single aircraft could not replace the bulk of trucks, yet even a few crates of fuel or ammunition meant survival for another day. Every delivery mattered, and every absence was felt on the battlefield. Soldiers at the front held rifles that might go silent without ammunition. Families in the cities feared starvation without imported food. The loss of Burma's road made the stakes for the Hump painfully clear. For the Americans, the new task demanded sacrifices unimagined in the old days of overland convoys. Air crews accepted that many flights would never return. Mountains claimed some, storms claimed others. Mechanical failures, navigation errors, and sheer exhaustion added to the toll. Yet the commitment remained, for the alternative was to watch China collapse completely. In this contrast between what had been and what was now, the gravity of the mission came into focus. The road had been cut, but the fight for survival would now rise into the skies. It was in this sharp break from past to present that the story of the Hump took on its most defining shape. The calm determination of truck drivers on jungle roads had been replaced by the nerve-wracking courage of pilots threading through storms above the world's highest mountains. Where once the struggle had been against mud and heat, it was now against ice and wind. The battle had shifted from the ground to the sky, and in that shift lay both the terror and the triumph of what was to come. The decision to fly supplies across the Himalayas was born not out of bold vision, but of desperation. By 1942, the Japanese advance had tightened its grip across Asia, and China's survival hung by a thread. American leaders understood the strategic importance of keeping China in the war. If China collapsed, Japanese forces would be free to turn south or redirect divisions against other Allied strongholds. Yet the question remained, how could a nation cut off by mountains higher than any in the world be supplied? The answer, though unthinkable to many, was to send aircraft directly over those peaks. At first, even seasoned military planners doubted the idea. Flying across the Himalayas was considered nearly impossible. The mountains rose higher than most aircraft could safely fly, weather was unpredictable, and navigation tools were primitive. But with no road left and no other passage available, there was no real choice. The plan to use air transport was not a matter of preference, but of survival. America committed itself to a gamble, one that would test not only its machines, but the men who flew them. The pilots who took on the task were often young and inexperienced, many barely out of training. Few had ever flown in mountain conditions, and almost none had seen peaks that soared beyond 20,000 feet. Imagine being 22 years old, suddenly thrust into an assignment where every mission carried a chance of disaster. Briefings were short and blunt, warning crews of thin air, violent storms, and the reality that many aircraft would never return. Yet there was no time to hesitate. The demand for supplies was immediate, and the first flights launched with only the most basic preparation. The tools available were frighteningly limited. Radios often failed in the interference of high-altitude storms. Weather forecasts were little more than guesses, pieced together from reports days old. Navigation maps lacked detail, with entire valleys and ridges left blank. Cockpits were not designed for the brutal cold of those heights, and crews sometimes wrapped themselves in layers of blankets just to endure the freezing air. Inside the cargo holds, fuel drums and crates of ammunition rattled with every gust of turbulence, a reminder of the dangerous cargo balanced precariously above the mountains. Despite these hardships, the flights began, and the route took on a name whispered with dread: the Hump. The word spread quickly among the crews, shorthand for the Himalayan wall they were expected to cross. The name itself carried a grim sense of humor, as if calling it a hump made it sound smaller, more manageable, less terrifying. In truth, every man knew it was no ordinary obstacle. It was a barrier of nature that cared nothing for war or survival, a test of endurance that would claim many lives. Still, the missions continued because failure meant leaving China to face defeat alone. For the Chinese people, the origins of the Hump were not just a logistical decision, but a lifeline suddenly promised in the darkest of times. News spread that American aircraft were attempting to cross the mountains, bringing supplies that might turn despair into resilience. Farmers, soldiers, and families in China looked to the skies with renewed hope, listening for the distant hum of engines that carried food, medicine, and weapons. Even a single crate could mean the difference between holding out or collapsing. The emotional weight of this effort gave meaning to every risk taken in the air. Thus, from the ashes of defeat in Burma, the Hump was born. It was not the product of careful planning or technological certainty. It was an act of necessity, a bold gamble forced by circumstance. What began as a desperate idea became one of the most dangerous airlift operations in history. And in its beginnings, the stage was set for a campaign where geography itself became the enemy, and courage the only weapon strong enough to face it. When the first flight successfully crossed the Himalayas and landed in China, their impact was immediate and profound. Supplies that had seemed impossible to obtain suddenly appeared on the ground, carried over the most forbidding mountains in the world. The deliveries were small compared to what had once arrived through Burma, but they were enough to sustain Chinese forces on the battlefield. Every drum of aviation fuel kept planes flying. Every crate of ammunition gave soldiers the means to fight another day. Each successful crossing meant that China's resistance, though battered, would not collapse. On the front lines, the difference was felt in the most tangible ways. Chinese soldiers who had been close to running out of weapons and ammunition received the resources they desperately needed. Trucks that had been stranded without fuel now roared back to life, carrying supplies and troops to vital points of defense. In field hospitals, American-delivered medicine saved the lives of men who might otherwise have died from wounds or disease. The war in China had been suffocating under isolation, but now the trickle of supplies across the Hump gave it oxygen. Against a relentless enemy, this lifeline made the difference between despair and survival. Imagine being a soldier in a ragged uniform, standing in a remote village where the battle had left its mark. The sound of enemy artillery echoed in the distance. Then, high above, the faint roar of engines broke through the sky. Looking up, you would see the shape of an American transport plane passing overhead, banking toward a makeshift landing field. For that soldier, it was more than a plane. It was proof that the world beyond China still remembered their fight, that their sacrifices were not in vain. That sound of engines became a symbol of hope carried on the wind. For the Japanese, the effect was far less welcome. They had hoped that cutting off Burma would starve China into surrender, forcing its government to collapse under the pressure of isolation. Instead, they found Chinese resistance still alive, fueled by supplies that seemed to appear against all logic. Japanese commanders realized that the skies above the Himalayas had become a new battlefield. one that could not be conquered with armies or tanks. They could seize land and cities, but they could not stop the Americans from daring the mountains again and again. The hump made isolation impossible, and with it, Japan's strategy was undermined. The psychological effect of these supplies was almost as powerful as the material aid itself. For Chinese civilians, every shipment reminded them that their struggle was shared. For soldiers, every bullet and every ration strengthened the will to keep fighting. For the American crews, the successful deliveries gave meaning to the dangers they faced. Knowing that each landing in China meant survival for allies on the front made the frozen winds and terrifying storms worth enduring. The bond forged through these deliveries was one of sacrifice and shared determination, uniting men separated by language and culture in a common cause. It was not a flood of supplies, but it was enough to keep the flame of resistance burning. The battlefield impact of the hump was measured not only in numbers, but in spirit. Without these flights, the Chinese army might have fractured, its soldiers scattered, its people crushed under occupation. With them, the war continued, and Japan remained tied down in a brutal conflict that drained its strength. In this way, the dangerous gamble of flying the hump reshaped the balance of power, not through overwhelming abundance, but through the stubborn persistence of survival. The flights over the hump carried more than weapons, fuel, and medicine. They carried the weight of an alliance that was fragile, strained by distance and culture, but bound by necessity. For the United States, each delivery symbolized a commitment to China, a promise that America would not let its ally collapse under the weight of Japanese aggression. For China, every arrival represented proof that their struggle was recognized on the world stage. It was a partnership forged not in comfort, but in the shared fire of survival. The consequences of this effort rippled far beyond the cargo holds of transport planes. By keeping China in the fight, the hump ensured that Japan remained tied down on a vast front, unable to divert all of its resources to the Pacific or Southeast Asia. Millions of Japanese soldiers were required to maintain the war in China, soldiers who might otherwise have been redeployed against American forces in the Pacific Islands or British strongholds in India. The sky bridge over the Himalayas, though fragile and costly, became a quiet strategic weapon that shaped the larger course of the war. For the Chinese population, the flights carried a psychological force as powerful as the supplies themselves. Imagine being in a bombed-out city, its streets lined with rubble, its people worn thin by years of war. Suddenly, the distant growl of engines cut through the silence. The sound told the people that they were not forgotten, that aid was still coming, even from across mountains that seemed insurmountable. In that moment, hope itself became a weapon, strengthening the will to endure. The wider consequence of the hump was not only in tonnage delivered, but in morale restored. For American pilots, the consequences were deeply personal. Every mission risked their lives, yet every success proved the mission was worth the sacrifice. The bond formed with China was not only political, but human. Crews who survived spoke of villagers greeting them with gratitude, of soldiers saluting them as heroes. They knew the danger was constant, but they also knew that without them, an entire nation might collapse. This sense of responsibility gave their sacrifice a purpose larger than themselves. The hump also redefined the role of geography in the war. The Himalayas were no longer just mountains, but an active front line. Nature itself had become an adversary, shaping strategy as powerfully as any army. To conquer these peaks with aircraft was to prove that determination could overcome even the harshest of obstacles. In this way, the flights were more than a logistical solution. They became a symbol of human will against the indifference of nature, a triumph of resolve over impossibility. In the larger arc of the war, the wider consequences of the hump were unmistakable. It was not a single battle or campaign that decided China's survival, but a relentless stream of flights over the mountains. These missions tied together two nations separated by oceans and language, creating a bond that reshaped the fight against Japan. By refusing to let China be isolated, America kept the balance of the war tilted just enough to prevent disaster. The consequences of that decision echoed across battlefields far beyond the Himalayas, proving that sometimes the quietest struggles can shape the loudest victories. The story of the Hump reached its climax not in a single moment of victory, but in the relentless endurance of thousands of flights stitched together over years. By late 1943 and into 1944, the airlift had become a lifeline that could no longer be dismissed as an experiment. It was now a vast, ongoing campaign carried out in some of the deadliest flying conditions in the world. Pilots flew day and night, often with little rest, their bodies worn thin by exhaustion and cold. The air above the Himalayas became a place where death was constant, but where courage soared just as high. At the height of the operation, hundreds of aircraft crossed the mountains every month, creating a fragile bridge of steel and determination. Imagine standing on the runway at an Indian airfield, watching transport after transport climb into the stormy sky, each one vanishing into the clouds with uncertain fate. The roar of engines blended with the cries of ground crews shouting final checks. Some of those planes would never return, their wreckage destined to lie buried in snow and stone. Yet the flights never stopped. The rhythm of departures became the heartbeat of the mission, steady and unyielding. For the crews, the climax meant facing dangers that grew more intense as the mission expanded. Storms rolled across the mountains with little warning, turning clear skies into walls of lightning and ice. Pilots fought turbulence so violent it threw men from their seats and tore loose cargo from its bindings. Oxygen masks froze, engines stalled in the thin air, and frost crept across windshields until visibility vanished completely. Imagine the fear of flying blind through the clouds, knowing that a mountain peak could appear without warning. In those moments, survival depended as much on instinct as on training. Yet, despite the fear, determination drove them forward. Each successful crossing meant more fuel, more ammunition, more medicine in the hands of Chinese allies. The Japanese, expecting China to collapse, instead saw its resistance persist, fed by supplies that seemed to defy logic. The climax of the Hump was not a single triumphant mission, but the unbroken chain of victories over nature itself. Every successful delivery was another blow against Japan's strategy, another proof that the impossible could be done. The human cost, however, was staggering. Thousands of men lost their lives attempting the crossings. Wreckage littered the hidden valleys of the Himalayas, becoming silent tombs of courage and sacrifice. Fellow pilots would sometimes fly over crash sites, seeing twisted metal glinting in the snow, a grim reminder of what awaited if luck ran out. And yet they continued. The willingness to risk everything again and again became the defining mark of the operation, a level of resolve rarely matched in any theater of the war. By the time the airlift reached its peak, the Hump was no longer a desperate gamble, but a relentless force. It had grown into a symbol of endurance, proving that sheer determination could triumph over geography, weather, and human fear. The climax of this campaign was not a moment of final victory, but the steady, grinding persistence of men who refused to give up. Against the tallest mountains on earth and the fiercest storms in the sky, they carved a lifeline that kept hope alive. In those long, punishing years, the impossible became routine, and in doing so, it reshaped the war in Asia. When the war finally ended, the roar of transport aircraft over the Himalayas slowly faded into silence. The airfields in India grew quiet, and the skies that had once been filled with the hum of engines returned to their natural stillness. For many, the story of the Hump was overshadowed by the great battles in Europe and the Pacific, by the storming of beaches and the raising of flags on distant islands. Yet, for those who had flown it, and for those in China who had depended on it, the Hump was a memory that would never fade. It was not just a supply route, it was a lifeline carved through the heavens. The legacy of the Hump was written not in the tonnage of cargo delivered, but in the endurance of spirit. Thousands of men risked and often lost their lives to keep China fighting. Their sacrifice did not bring glory or headlines, but it saved a nation from isolation and collapse. Imagine walking through the villages of China at the time, where families knew that the survival of their communities depended on the supplies carried across those peaks. To them, the sound of aircraft overhead was as vital as the beating of their own hearts. It meant that hope still lived, even in the darkest of hours. For the United States, the Hump became a symbol of determination and resolve. It showed the world that America would go to extraordinary lengths to support its allies, even when geography itself seemed impossible to overcome. For China, it was proof that they were not alone, that the global struggle against Japan was one they were part of, not apart from. The bond forged in those flights was built on sacrifice and trust, linking two nations in a partnership that endured beyond the war itself. In the quiet endurance of the Hump, the ideals of cooperation and commitment were made real. The men who flew the Hump carried its memory long after the war ended. Many remembered the biting cold, the endless storms, and the sight of mountains rising like walls before them. They spoke of comrades lost, of planes vanishing into clouds and never returning. But they also remembered the triumphs, the times when, against all odds, they broke through the storms and delivered their precious cargo to China. Their stories became part of the invisible fabric of history, a reminder of courage in the face of impossible odds. For them, the Hump was not just a mission, but a defining chapter of their lives. The Himalayas themselves still hold traces of that era. Even today, the wreckage of lost planes rests in hidden valleys, silent memorials to those who gave their lives in the struggle. Nature has reclaimed much of it, yet the memory endures among those who know the story. Each piece of twisted metal and each forgotten site marks the cost of a campaign that reshaped the war in Asia. The mountains keep their secrets, but the echoes of those flights remain, whispered in the wind that sweeps across the high peaks. In the end, the legacy of the Hump was both simple and profound. It showed that war is not always won by grand battles alone, but also by the quiet persistence of men who refuse to give in. It proved that even when geography becomes an enemy, human determination can find a way forward. The flights over the Himalayas were a testament to courage, endurance, and sacrifice, qualities that endure long after the last plane returned. The Hump was more than a supply route. It was a bridge of hope, built against the sky that carried a nation through its darkest days and left a legacy written not in stone, but in the hearts of those who remember.